Under the silver haze of early morning fog, the lake lay silent and motionless, like a sheet of tarnished glass that had forgotten how to ripple. The air was still, heavy with the scent of wet pine, and the only sound came from the creaking wooden boards beneath Oliver Sloane's boots as he stepped out onto the deck of his late uncle's lake cabin. He stood there, mug of burnt coffee in hand, staring at the bridge, the only access point to the property. It was a narrow structure, aged but reinforced, rigged with a solar-powered gate system that he controlled through his phone. A simple precaution, maybe, but for Oliver, it had become a symbol of quiet resistance, the kind of boundary the world no longer seemed to respect. At 57, Oliver was neither a recluse nor some disenchanted retiree who hated humanity. He had lived enough life in logistics management to understand systems, deadlines, and the unbearable noise of constant expectation. He didn't move to the lake to escape people. He moved to reclaim space, real, measurable space, a place where his time belonged to him and where each hour stretched out like the calm water beyond his windows. He wasn't hiding. He was simplifying. And for the last 3 years, the cabin had allowed him to do just that: repair the old wood frame by hand, install motion lights under the eaves, learn the rhythms of wildlife, and, for the first time in decades, sleep without checking his phone. The cabin itself was modest, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and a dock that bowed slightly from years of use. It had been in the family for decades, though Oliver had only visited sporadically until he inherited it. His Uncle Wallace, an old surveyor with a penchant for solitude and maps, had left behind little more than a battered canoe, an ancient rifle, and a well-kept filing cabinet full of detailed hand-drawn property lines. Those maps became gospel to Oliver. Every foot of shoreline, every corner stake in the surrounding woods had meaning. When he wasn't sanding beams or patching the tin roof, he was out walking the boundaries, making sure the world remembered where his began and ended. And then came the intrusion. At first, it was subtle. A plastic water bottle left near the dock. Footprints on the wet gravel by the woodshed. He figured it might be kids, local teens daring each other across the bridge. But then he noticed something else. A fresh gouge in the gate post, as if someone had tried to pry the latch open. It hadn't worked, thanks to the steel pin bolted through the locking mechanism, but it raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He checked the app on his phone. No alerts, no recorded entries. That same evening, he added 2 more motion sensors near the bridge, this time connected to a backup battery and silent alarm system. He wasn't paranoid. He was methodical. In logistics, you never trusted systems without redundancies. Then came the people. It was a bright Thursday morning, unusually warm for early spring, and Oliver was out back mending the greenhouse netting when he heard voices, several of them. Oh, he froze, not out of fear but confusion. Visitors were rare and he hadn't scheduled any deliveries. The voices grew louder, buoyant, excited even, and when he stepped around the side of the house, he saw them. A group of 10 or 12 people, mostly middle-aged, dressed like they were on a guided hike, phones out, cameras clicking. One woman pointed toward the cabin's upper window and said, "This was his sleeping quarters, they say. Completely original." A man beside her nodded knowingly, as if he had read this somewhere official. Oliver stood still, waiting for someone to notice him, but the group moved past him as though he were part of the scenery, until he cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, not loudly, but enough to halt the woman mid-sentence. She blinked. "Oh, are you the caretaker?" "No, I own this property. Who are you people?" There was a beat of silence. Then someone in the back spoke up. "Karen told us this was the last authentic stop on the Lakeside Heritage Trail." "Karen who?" Another man stepped forward, clutching a brochure. "Karen waits. She runs the little gallery and cafe in town. Said this cabin was used by some regional sculptor back in the 50s. Apparently, it's part of local history now. Oliver took the brochure. His cabin was right there on the last panel, under a sepia-toned filter with stylized text. Final stop, the Artisan's Refuge. Visit only during daylight hours. Respect the space. Respect the space? He turned the brochure over. No contact information, just a QR code and a link to a website that wouldn't load without decent signal, which he didn't have. The group began dispersing around the yard like this was a scheduled stop, whispering and pointing at things he had built with his own hands. He tried to stop them, politely at first, then firmly, but they responded with apologies and phrases like, "We were told it was open to the public." Someone even asked if they could see inside. It took Oliver almost an hour to escort them off the property, and even then, one woman lingered at the dock, taking selfies until he stepped in front of her lens. Oh. That night, he sat in the living room staring at the empty mug in his hand, unsure whether to feel violated or just confused. The bridge gate had been open. That was on him. He had expected decency to act as its own kind of barrier. But this wasn't ignorance. This was something manufactured, organized. The next day, he drove into town. Karen Waits was easy to find. Her gallery cafe sat near the marina, half tourist trap, half rustic charm. It sold overpriced lemonade and framed prints of lake sunsets. Karen herself greeted him with a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. "I take it you're here about the tour," she said before he even introduced himself. "I am. You're advertising my property as part of a trail, without permission." Karen's tone stayed light, but her gaze sharpened. "The Artisan's Trail is a curated experience for cultural enrichment. You'd be amazed how many locals have never even seen the original shoreline cabins. I'd be more amazed if any of them were allowed to walk across my bridge." She laughed as if he'd made a joke. "Oh, Oliver, it's all about community. People need access to beauty." "No," he said flatly. "They need permission, and you don't have it." Karen's smile flickered. "We can work something out. Revenue sharing, exposure, a QR system for booking. We already do that with the dock across from Miller's Point." He shook his head. "Not interested. Remove my cabin from your map. Now." Karen's friendliness cooled like a window in shadow. "Be careful, Oliver. Sometimes exclusivity makes people curious. And curiosity, well, it always finds a way." Oliver left without another word. That night he locked the bridge gate from his phone, ran a test on the backup battery, and set his sensors to record. He added a second layer of security to the server, enabled with a timed code. And then he sat on the porch with the lights off, staring at the water, the trees, the slope of the opposite shore, wondering what the hell he had just stepped into. He had always believed privacy was a simple matter of location and discipline. But Karen Waits didn't care about boundaries. She cared about narrative. And she had just turned his home into a tourist attraction. Without asking, without warning, without shame. Something had shifted, and he felt it in his bones. This wasn't going to stop with a conversation. It never did. Under a gray ceiling of low-hanging clouds, the stillness of the lake returned like a reflex, pretending nothing had changed. But Oliver Sloane knew better. The intrusion had not been an accident, nor was it over. A brochure could be a mistake, a miscommunication even. But the calm that followed that first group's departure felt manufactured, as though someone had pulled the curtain shut just long enough to regroup behind it. He didn't open the gate again. The bridge remained sealed, the lock engaged via his phone, and the sensors were now tied directly to an alert system routed through a private cloud relay, just in case the local signal went down. He wasn't an alarmist, but he believed in infrastructure. He believed in being prepared. What he didn't believe in was that silence could be trusted. Not anymore. 3 days later, Oliver was in the back clearing fallen branches from the recent windstorm when he heard the unmistakable crackle of gravel underfoot. Not from the direction of the bridge, but from the side trail, the narrow, overgrown path that used to serve as a fire break along the southern boundary of the property. He froze, listening, and a moment later came the sound of hushed voices, then a child's laugh. He moved quietly through the underbrush, making no noise, and when he reached the tree line, he saw them again. Another group. This time they were arriving from the lake, not the bridge. A small outboard boat bobbed near the shoreline, tied loosely to a half-buried tree stump. 12 or 13 people, maybe more. Some carried cameras, some carried coolers. One man held a drone controller, looking toward the sky with a smug satisfaction that irritated Oliver more than he expected. They weren't lost. They weren't wandering. They were following a path that had been planned, rehearsed, and they weren't surprised to be there. They moved with the entitlement of tourists following an itinerary. Oliver stepped out of the brush, hands at his sides, calm but direct. "This is private property," he said. "You need to leave." One woman blinked in confusion, then smiled uncertainly. "Oh, we were told this was an open access zone. Part of the cultural loop?" "There's no such thing as an open access zone," Oliver said. "There's private land and public land. This is private." The man with the drone controller laughed and shook his head. "Karen said you were intense. Didn't realize she meant this intense. Leave. Now." Oliver's tone flattened. Not raised, not angry, just final. The group hesitated. Some began shuffling back toward the shoreline. A few muttered apologies. But the drone guy wasn't finished. He gestured toward the cabin and said, "You know, you could make real money if you just let it happen. Sell tickets, install some benches, maybe even a coffee stand near the dock. People love curated authenticity." Oliver didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man seemed to understand he had reached the edge of something, and after a few more minutes the group began to depart. The last to leave was a teenage boy, maybe 16, who lingered at the corner of the cabin, tracing his fingers along the wood grain like it meant something to him. Oliver watched until the boy rejoined the others, then waited until the boat's motor faded into the distance. When the shoreline was once again quiet, he walked back up to the cabin, picked up the survey maps from his uncle's filing cabinet, and began marking the tree line where the group had entered. That evening, he called his attorney in the city. He had never needed legal counsel before, but he had kept the number of Richard Delaney, a methodical property rights lawyer who had once helped his uncle resolve a boundary dispute over a collapsed stone wall. Delaney answered on the third ring and listened as Oliver explained what had happened. No dramatics, just the facts. Repeated incursions, unauthorized use of his property, and a local business using his cabin as part of a commercial tour without consent. Delaney asked for photos, any brochures, and video footage if available. Oliver had all three. The lawyer promised to begin inquiries and reach out with preliminary advice within the week. In the meantime, Oliver decided to approach this the only way he knew how, systematically. He set up trail cameras with wide angles along the southern and western flanks of the property. He programmed them for night vision and motion triggers. The footage would feed into the same private server that backed up the bridge system. Then he ordered a custom sign, not one of those generic red and white plaques, but a hand-carved wooden marker that read, "Private land, no tours, trespassers will be reported." He installed it at the landing spot where the last group had come ashore. The next 2 days passed without incident. Oliver busied himself with chores, tightening gutters, cleaning the stovepipe, reorganizing the shed. He almost began to believe the worst was over. But then came the humming. It was just past 10 in the morning when the low buzz reached his ears. Distant at first, then closer. He stepped out onto the porch and scanned the sky. The drone was small, white with flashing lights and a visible camera eye. It hovered above the cabin, rotated slowly, then dipped lower. Oliver followed its movement, walking calmly to the side of the cabin, where he had installed a telescopic pole for cleaning high windows. He unclamped it from the wall, extended it fully, and when the drone swooped in for a second pass, he swung it once, hard. The pole hit the drone's undercarriage. The machine jerked sideways, tilted, and spiraled down into the underbrush with a soft, brittle crash. He found it half buried under dead leaves. The casing was cracked and the rotor arms were bent. It was still blinking, attempting to stay online. Oliver picked it up and carried it inside. He placed it on the kitchen counter, filmed a slow 360-degree video of its condition, then wrapped it in a towel and sealed it in a plastic container. Evidence. For later. The lawyer called back that night. Delaney's voice was calm but concerned. He had reviewed the brochure and confirmed that the cabin had been added to a privately organized tour called the Lakeside Artisan Trail. There was no formal approval process because it wasn't registered as a public initiative, just a local effort run by a businesswoman named Karen Waits. Delaney explained that this meant the tour wasn't technically illegal unless it trespassed onto private property. The issue was enforcement. The burden of proof, as always, fell on the landowner. Oliver asked what he could do in the short term. File a cease and desist, Delaney said. Send it directly to Ms. Waits and to any entities affiliated with her business. Then place visible signage and record all incursions. The more data we collect, the stronger your case. Also, you might consider installing a shore barrier or restricting access to the lake edge. Oliver nodded to himself. Already done. Delaney paused, then added, I'll also issue a formal notice to the town's small business registry. If she's using the trail as a revenue stream, there may be permits involved. If not, it's another lever. After the call, Oliver sat by the window for a long time, watching the darkness gather over the water. His cabin, once a retreat, had become a contested zone. And it wasn't just about tourists or brochures anymore. It was about ownership, control. Karen wasn't some eccentric neighbor or well-meaning organizer. She was a strategist. She knew how to work around systems, to weaponize ambiguity, and she wasn't going to stop because of a polite phone call or a sternly worded letter. The next morning, Oliver received an envelope in the mailbox attached to the old bridge post. It wasn't mailed, no stamp, no return address. Just his name in cursive script. Inside was a single printed page. It read, "You're making this harder than it has to be. There's room for everyone here. You don't want to be seen as the problem." No name, no signature, just that veiled threat wrapped in polite community jargon. He read it twice, then burned it in the wood stove without saying a word. That evening, he reprogrammed the Bridgegate's access protocol to randomize the pin daily. He updated the camera firmware, rewired the cabin's perimeter lights to solar backups, and for the first time since he'd moved in, he loaded the rifle left behind by his uncle. Not out of fear, out of clarity. This was no longer a question of misunderstanding. It was a question of resolve. And Oliver Sloane was ready to hold the line. The days that followed brought a strange kind of tension to the lake. A drawn-out silence that didn't feel like peace, but rather the breath someone takes before saying something they can't take back. Oliver Sloane went about his routines with the same quiet discipline that had kept him grounded for years, checking the perimeter, trimming the undergrowth, and making sure every component of his gate system responded without delay. But he had the sense, deep in his chest and behind his eyes, that he was no longer alone out there. It wasn't paranoia, it was intuition. The sharp-edged kind that came not from fantasy but from 100 small indicators lining up just enough to make the world tilt slightly out of its usual balance. It started with the sensors. He had installed motion triggers at the edge of the property, 2 near the lake trail, 1 at the slope behind the shed, and another just inside the tree line where the bridge began. They weren't complicated devices. They didn't even record video. They simply sent notifications whenever they were tripped. Usually that meant deer, sometimes raccoons, but not like this. 3 triggers went off at once just after midnight, all 3 from separate edges of the property, spaced too far apart to be animals and too simultaneous to be coincidence. The alerts were clean. No sign of entry afterward, no footprints, no damage, nothing missing. Oliver walked the perimeter in the morning, measured the depressions in the moss and dirt, and found nothing but a trail of broken pine needles and disturbed brush, marks left by someone careful but not invisible. The next morning, he discovered the bridge gate was unlocked. Not damaged, not broken, unlocked. He had checked the logs. The access codes hadn't been used. The app didn't register any override, yet the locking mechanism had been disengaged, as though someone had known how to bypass the hardware entirely. He examined the casing and found no scratches, no tool marks. But the panel had been lifted and gently reseated. Whoever had done it hadn't been in a hurry. They had known what they were doing. Oliver didn't panic. He changed the firmware on the controller, removed remote access to the gate from his phone, and instead programmed it to respond only to physical key input, a hard override that required a chip card. He had 2, 1 in his pocket, and the backup inside a metal box locked in the cabin's wall safe. He removed the keypad entirely and replaced it with a solid plate, bolted and welded. The sensors he upgraded to live-feed trail cams, each wired to independent solar batteries in case the main line was compromised. This wasn't reaction. This was reinforcement, the kind of thing any sensible man would do when his home was being circled like meat in water. And then the mailbox started filling. At first it was just a few handwritten notes, requests mostly. Please reconsider access. This site is important for community engagement. Then came the emails, unsigned but coordinated, each using the same wording, as though copied from a script. Your refusal to collaborate with local projects reflects poorly on the spirit of lakeside stewardship. A polite way of calling him selfish, of framing him as the outlier. Karen's hand was all over it, not in the handwriting but in the style, in the pleasant, almost maternal passive aggression that dared you to object without sounding unreasonable. Oliver collected everything and forwarded it to Delaney, who responded 2 days later with a formal warning. The language was vague, legally toothless, but if it continued, they could file for harassment. But that wasn't what bothered Oliver most. Oh, what unsettled him, what kept him awake past midnight, wasn't the letters or even the subtle pressure. It was the noise. He began to notice it at night, low, distant, mechanical. Not a boat motor. More rhythmic than that. Almost like a generator, but with a strange undertone, a vibration that carried through the ground. He tried to trace it, but it always stopped when he stepped outside, as if it knew he was listening. And then one morning, he found the canoe. It had been pulled up onto his north bank just past the large cedar stump where the underbrush grew thick. No name on the hull, no registration number. Just a long fiberglass canoe, clearly used, with muddy boot prints inside and a small discarded wrapper from an energy bar. Oliver towed it into the water, paddled it 50 feet out, and sank it with a hatchet. He watched it vanish beneath the surface, the water closing over it without protest, then rowed back and reinforced the bank with large stones to prevent future landings. That same evening, Karen showed up. He hadn't seen her since their conversation at the cafe, but she arrived just after sunset, dressed in a crisp navy blazer and athletic shoes, walking the bridge like she had every right to be there. The gate was shut, but she stood behind it and waved, smiling like a neighbor stopping by for lemonade. "I'd like to talk," she said. Oliver stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed, not approaching. "You're trespassing." "I'm standing on the bridge," she replied. "Technically, this part is still considered a shared passageway by the township. It's welded shut. No one shares it." Karen's smile faltered for a second, just enough to show the mask slipping. "There's no need to escalate this." "Then stop sending people here." "I've asked them to pause the tours," she said carefully. "But people are curious. You can't stop that." "You don't need to lie." "I'm offering a compromise," she said. "You allow access a few days a week, scheduled visits only. No disruption. I can compensate you, and in exchange the pressure stops. The attention fades. Everyone wins." Oliver shook his head slowly. "I'm not here to win anything. I'm here to be left alone." Karen's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but calculation. "Then maybe you're in the wrong place, because this lake, it's not just yours." She turned and left without waiting for a reply. The gate buzzed slightly as she passed, as though it remembered her from before. The next morning, Oliver woke to the smell of burning. Not fire, not wood smoke, something fouler. He found it behind the greenhouse, a pile of charred trash smoldering in a black circle on the grass. Plastic, rubber, something chemical. He put it out with water, then walked the perimeter. On a tree near the south trail, someone had stapled a flyer. It wasn't from Karen's group. It was anonymous, plain text, nothing graphic. It read, "History belongs to all of us. Selfishness is not protection. You will be held accountable." He didn't report it. He simply added it to the growing file. Evidence. Proof. Later that week, he noticed one of the trail cameras had gone dark. The battery pack was missing. Just gone. The wiring had been clipped clean with a tool. No tear, no chew marks. Professional. Delaney suggested installing GPS tags in future devices. Oliver ordered them the same day. He no longer slept fully. Not from fear, but from readiness. Every creak in the wood, every rustle outside made him sit up, calculate, assess. He didn't keep the rifle loaded, but he kept it clean and within reach. The legal battle was slow. The court system wasn't built for urgency, but Oliver understood timelines. He knew that pressure, applied long enough, wears down steel. Karen wasn't backing off. She was changing tactics, diversifying, turning the community itself into a weapon. He heard from a neighbor across the lake, someone he'd only nodded at in passing, who now stopped responding to his greetings. Then another. A man who once shared fishing tips at the dock now looked away when their paths crossed. Karen was winning not with force, but with erosion. She was reshaping the story. But Oliver had one advantage. He had the truth, and he had patience. And unlike Karen, he didn't need to convince anyone. He just needed to hold the line. The weather turned as if cued by the tension building on the property. Long stretches of low, overcast skies, constant humidity that clung to every surface, and rain that came not in storms, but in long, slow drizzles that turned the forest floor to mud and made the cabin feel more isolated than ever. For most, the gloom would have added to the weariness, but for Oliver it clarified things. As the natural world slowed and darkened, his focus sharpened. He was no longer responding. He was preparing. The line had been crossed, not with fanfare or violence, but with persistent violation. People had learned his name without his consent, walked his land like it was theirs, and now, through the careful manipulations of one woman's ambition, he was becoming a villain in his own story. He wasn't naive enough to believe the courts would move fast. Delaney had been upfront about that. Restraining orders took time. Civil cases moved at the speed of ink drying on forms. In the meantime, the best defense was documentation and presence. The cameras were upgraded, now equipped with night vision and motion-triggered spotlights. He installed a weatherproof lockbox at the cabin's front post, where he kept hard drives rotated weekly, physically removed, and stored off-site. He purchased acoustic sensors and installed 2 along the lake's southern inlet, not to record sound, but to track directional movement through water. His lawyer's advice had been to gather without engaging, to let Karen and her proxies act without knowing how closely they were being watched. But Karen knew things. Not details, those were locked down, but tone, timing, strategy. She shifted the conversation online, using her gallery's social media to float passive commentary about legacy resistance and gatekeepers of natural heritage. She never named him, never directly referenced the cabin, but anyone local understood. She posted soft-edged images of lake mist over old docks, quoted artists about sharing sacred spaces, and encouraged respectful exploration of forgotten local gems. The comments did the rest. Her audience built the villain for her. Oliver saw the shift in real time. Traffic increased, not in volume, but in purpose. The people who came now weren't lost. They arrived in 2s or 3s, spoke little, stayed on the perimeter. They took photos from a distance, left no trash, and slipped away quietly. This wasn't tourism anymore. It was surveillance. Karen had turned the place into folklore. The more Oliver resisted, the more mysterious it became. He'd been reduced to a symbol of something larger than himself, the man who closed the gate. And then the server was breached. It happened at 3:17 a.m. The system sent an automated ping. Connection dropped, camera feed offline, external relay disabled. He was awake. He didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a time anymore, and immediately checked the physical control board. Power was steady. Backup still running. The issue wasn't local, it was the network itself. Someone had flooded the router with requests, overwhelming the relay point. When he checked the logs later, the request origin was masked through a series of proxies, but he wasn't a stranger to digital infrastructure. This wasn't random. It had taken planning. Precision. He shut down the system manually and pulled the drives. Whatever had been captured before the blackout was still intact. When Delaney heard the details, his tone shifted. "That's a move," he said plainly. "Not random vandalism. Not teenage mischief. It's pressure. And it's digital evidence." He advised Oliver to file a police report, not because it would lead to anything immediate, but because it created an official timestamp, a line in the sand. Oliver agreed, but insisted the report remain factual and emotionless. He didn't want pity. He wanted process. He didn't want to be seen as paranoid. He wanted to be taken seriously. A few days later, an officer from the sheriff's department came to the cabin to review the report in person. He was young, polite, and clearly uncomfortable. He asked careful questions, logged the server details, and did not promise follow-up. When Oliver asked whether the department would speak to Karen directly, the deputy paused. "Ms. Waits is respected. She's got her hand in a lot of community initiatives." The statement was polite code for, "We don't want to get involved." The deputy wasn't hostile. He was cautious. Oliver could respect that. People like Karen built power quietly and carefully. They weren't criminals. They were connectors. They made everyone owe them something. That night, Oliver sat by the dock and watched the lake as clouds drifted over the moon. He remembered something his uncle once said about the water. It never keeps secrets. It only delays them. At the time, it had sounded like metaphor. Now, it felt like warning. He went back inside and retrieved a folder he hadn't touched in months. One that contained the original sale documents, the easement agreements, and the boundary lines his uncle had fought to verify. It was all there, hand-signed and notarized. Clear proof that the land leading to the bridge, the shoreline, and the surrounding wooded buffer zone were all private, owned by the Sloan family without contest. But legal lines weren't physical walls, and right now those lines were being walked over as though they didn't matter. 2 nights later, Oliver's perimeter lights flickered on without cause. No movement on the cameras, no sound on the sensors. But when he went outside to investigate, he found a single object placed neatly at the edge of the porch. A piece of wood, freshly sanded, carved with a date. Just a date. 3 weeks in the future. No note, no explanation. Just the date. Delaney was puzzled. Could be symbolic, could be a planned event, could be intimidation. "It's a message," Oliver said, "but not for me. It's for her." He meant Karen, of course, and he was right. A week passed. Quiet again. Too quiet. Oliver made no changes to the property, no updates to the system, no calls to the lawyer. He just watched, documented, waited, and that patience paid off. Late one night he saw a small boat pull to the far side of the lake and drop anchor near a wooded inlet. 2 people disembarked and began marking trees with reflective tape. Not loudly, not carelessly, just efficiently. They didn't approach the cabin. They didn't make noise. But they were preparing something. The next morning, Oliver called Delaney and requested a full land survey be conducted, not just to reaffirm the boundaries, but to officially log any changes or markings made by third parties. The lawyer agreed and scheduled a professional to visit the following week. In the meantime, Oliver hiked out to the inlet and removed every marker. He didn't confront. He didn't threaten. He simply erased their work. He left no sign he'd been there, only the absence of what they had left behind. On his return, he noticed something strange at the base of the bridge. A series of small drill holes beneath the metal support beam. Oh, clean, precise, evenly spaced. Someone had begun to weaken the structure. Not to destroy it, not yet, but to prepare it for removal. It was a slow sabotage, one designed not to collapse the bridge but to render it unstable. Unguarded access under the guise of structural failure. He repaired the damage in silence. Welded new steel plates over the base. Reinforced the supports with extra brackets. Then he sent Delaney a summary of the findings and made one final decision. He would disable the digital lock entirely. The gate would now be mechanical only, key entry. No phone access, no override. Just a cold, deliberate barrier between him and whatever was coming next. This was no longer about trespass. It was about siege. But Oliver Sloan wasn't defending a museum piece. He wasn't protecting nostalgia. He was defending space. He was defending the right to define his own silence. And when the date carved into that piece of wood finally came, whatever it meant, he'd be ready. Under a sky heavy with late-season heat and the slow rumble of approaching storms, the cabin stood at the edge of tension like a match waiting to be struck. The carved date, now only 3 days away, had anchored itself in Oliver Sloan's thoughts like a ticking metronome behind every decision. He kept the wood tucked in the drawer beside his bed, not because he feared it, but because he needed the reminder that whatever was coming had already been set in motion. This wasn't speculation anymore. Something was planned, and whether it was symbolic or tactical, it would happen on schedule. He wasn't waiting in fear. He was calculating how to counter an attack that hadn't yet revealed itself. Delaney had followed through with the land survey as requested. The professional arrived with drones, GPS equipment, and a quietly confident demeanor. He mapped every inch of the property, confirmed Oliver's ownership down to the smallest boulder near the dock, and photographed the previously drilled holes in the bridge supports. That report, signed and notarized, gave them legal leverage. Delaney filed for an emergency injunction that would prohibit any organized activity within a 100-foot radius of Oliver's boundary lines until a formal hearing could be scheduled. It was a temporary measure, more symbolic than enforceable, but it was a move. In chess terms, it forced the other player to respond or risk check. Karen responded. Not with a lawsuit, not with a confrontation. She responded with silence and a sudden surge in activity around the lake. Over the course of 48 hours, Oliver counted no fewer than 17 separate watercraft on the lake, all slowly drifting near his shoreline. None docked, none landed, but they were watching. One held a long-range lens camera aimed at the bridge. Another appeared to be filming a walkthrough from the perspective of the water. One group of kayakers wore matching shirts that read, "Preserve the Trail." That slogan had never appeared before. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a soft show of force, a display of cohesion. Karen wasn't acting alone. She had followers, volunteers, possibly investors. Oliver noted every craft, every timestamp. He filed daily updates to Delaney, but he also began planning differently. He understood now that this wasn't going to be resolved with letters or legal filings. It would escalate until someone crossed the line completely, and when they did, he had to be the one holding the facts, not the fury. He reinstalled a hidden camera inside the upper wall of the bridge support structure, angled down to catch the entry point from the water. He programmed it to stream live footage to an off-site cloud server, bypassing his internal system in case another digital blackout occurred. He set up 2 infrared traps, non-lethal, non-obvious, one on the slope behind the greenhouse and another near the fire trail. If tripped, they would silently activate a signal flare from beneath a camouflaged cylinder, releasing bright smoke to mark the exact location for hours. No alarms, no loud security response, just proof. That night, as he finished positioning the traps, he saw lights through the trees. Faint, cold, and steady. Flashlights moving slowly, no more than 100 yards beyond the property line. Whoever they were, they didn't step across. They lingered. One even sat on a log and stared directly at the cabin through a pair of binoculars. It was not curiosity. It was measurement. The next day, the local newspaper ran a feature titled, "Community Divided Over Lake Trail Access." It quoted Karen multiple times, always with soft, measured language about unity, cultural preservation, and the importance of respectful heritage. Engagement. Oliver's name wasn't mentioned, but there was a photo of his cabin, taken from the water, lens focused slightly upward to dramatize the angle. It looked remote, shadowed, even sinister. The article included a poll, asking readers if they believed natural access points should be open to the public if historically significant. The framing was not subtle. It suggested he was hiding something. It recast his silence as aggression. And it landed. The next time Oliver drove into town for supplies, the shift was visible. The clerk at the general store didn't make eye contact. The old man who sold bait and tackle didn't greet him. A family in the cafe lowered their voices when he passed. He wasn't hated, yet, but the story was being rewritten. In the absence of visibility, people filled in the gaps themselves. Karen had mastered that tactic. She didn't accuse. She implied. She didn't demand. She let others do it for her. When he returned to the cabin, there was a package on the steps. Unmarked, wrapped in brown paper. Inside, beneath layers of newspaper, was an old book on local architecture, one of those glossy coffee table pieces filled with stories of historic cabins and homes. A yellow sticky note was attached to the cover. It read, "You could be remembered." He burned it in the fire pit that evening without ceremony. 2 nights before the carved date, the first direct breach happened. At 2:11 a.m., the infrared sensor on the southern slope activated. The flare went up, a long stream of blue smoke designed to stay low to the ground and avoid drawing attention from neighbors. Oliver grabbed the spotlight and the rifle, unloaded but clearly visible, and moved silently along the path. What he found was worse than someone wandering. It was intentional damage. A section of fencing had been cut and peeled back, not broken but removed with care. Tied to the base was a small trail marker, red vinyl tape with a QR code printed on it. Scanning it later revealed a link to a private page, a countdown timer, and the words, "Open Day, the People's Passage." Delaney's voice the next morning was different. It wasn't calm. It was clipped, focused. "They're planning an event," he said. "Not just a protest. They're organizing something public and plausible enough to make legal intervention difficult." "Can I shut the bridge permanently?" Oliver asked. "You can. But if they arrive by water or on foot, you'll need to show restraint. Don't confront them. Just document everything." "What about the injunction?" "It gives us ground if they step onto your land. But you'll need witnesses." Neutral ones. "Do you have any neighbors who aren't aligned with her?" "Not anymore." Delaney paused. "Then I'm sending someone." The attorney dispatched a legal aide, a quiet woman named Mallory who had worked background support on cases involving property disputes in high-conflict zones, places where developers met with local resistance, where land had competing claims. She arrived that afternoon, parked her car half a mile down the trail, and moved into the guest room without ceremony. She carried no weapon, only a satchel of documentation tools, a camera, and 2 clipboards. She asked a few questions, nodded at the answers, and then began walking the perimeter herself. "She's good," Delaney texted later. "Treat her like your second pair of eyes." The night before the date, Oliver stayed awake, not out of dread but readiness. He and Mallory set up cameras, checked batteries, tested the emergency lock on the gate. Rain moved in late, slow, soaking, enough to muffle footsteps. At 3:04 a.m., the trail cam near the dock flickered, then froze. Mallory checked the live feed and noted 3 silhouettes moving along the edge of the water. No boats, no lights, just figures. At dawn, the sky opened slightly, letting through a sliver of watery gold as if to offer false hope. And then the first group arrived. They came in silence. 30, maybe 40 people walking along the trail in loose formation. Some wore matching ponchos with the phrase, "Lakeside belongs to everyone." A few carried banners. One man held a camera on a gimbal. At the front, dressed in white and smiling like she was hosting a fundraiser, was Karen. Oliver did not greet them. He and Mallory stood just inside the gate behind the locked fence. Mallory held a clipboard and a microphone, quietly narrating events for the record. Karen approached the gate and began to speak, not to them, but to the group behind her. "This cabin represents more than one man's claim to silence," she said. "It is part of a collective memory. We come not to steal or desecrate, but to witness." Oliver said nothing. Mallory clicked her pen, marked the time, and muttered, "That's incitement masked as cultural speech." Karen turned to the gate. "You still have a chance to join us, to be part of something larger than yourself." Oliver reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the manual override key, and inserted it into the lock. The gate did not open. Instead, the generator powering the backup mechanism shut down. The bridge lights dimmed, and the gate, which had been retrofitted weeks earlier, locked into its final, immovable state. Karen paused. The moment stretched. Then came the sound of sirens. Mallory stepped forward and handed her clipboard to the officer arriving at the trailhead. A second squad car pulled up behind. Delaney had filed a supplemental report that morning, triggering a check-in due to the planned event. Everything was in place. Evidence, video, signage, documentation. Karen backed away without a word. The crowd hesitated, murmured, dispersed. Oliver and Mallory stood still until the last banner was rolled up. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin. the carved piece of wood still in the drawer, now nothing more than a marker of a line they failed to cross. The days following the standoff passed with a deceptive sense of calm, as though the failed spectacle had drained the momentum from the opposition. The gate remained closed, the property untouched, and for the first time in weeks, Oliver felt the weight in his chest ease, though not vanish. Mallory remained on site for 2 more days, meticulously sorting and backing up video files, compiling a final report for Delaney that documented the event from 6 different vantage points. Her presence brought a quiet steadiness to the cabin, an unspoken affirmation that he wasn't imagining the threat, that everything he had done, every wire, every sensor, every act of quiet reinforcement, had been not just reasonable, but necessary. Then the message arrived. Unlike before, it wasn't anonymous or vaguely threatening. It was professional, printed on heavy paper, delivered via certified mail. The return address was a law firm, Fisher, Ryle, and Benton, and the tone was measured, almost corporate. Karen Waits, through her attorney, was filing for a declaratory judgment to challenge Oliver's claim to full private control of the shoreline access point. The language was strategic. It didn't accuse him of wrongdoing directly. Instead, it questioned the interpretation and scope of the original easement documentation, citing ambiguity regarding legacy passage rights via water-based ingress. In short, she was accusing him of unlawfully restricting public access to a natural water corridor. It was a smart move. Delaney confirmed it during their next call. She's shifting the battlefield, from direct pressure to legal ambiguity. This isn't about winning a verdict. It's about forcing you to fight on new terms, dragging you into a slow, expensive slog. The strategy was clear. Open a back door by challenging the definition of the shoreline's boundary. If a court agreed that water-based access wasn't clearly excluded, Karen could frame future visits as legal and justified, which would in turn reopen the door to public use, something that, once established, would be nearly impossible to revoke. Oliver wasn't surprised. Disgusted, yes, but not surprised. Karen had proven again and again that she would escalate without flinching, each move more calculated than the last. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply nodded and asked Delaney what it would take to shut the matter down completely. Counterclaim, Delaney said. Not just a response, a direct offensive. You file a claim for injunctive relief and damages, emotional distress, privacy violation, trespassing, sabotage. We bring up the drone, the sensors, the property damage. We submit the footage, the logs, the maps, the witness statements. We don't just defend. We go after her reputation, her business practices, her implied manipulation of the local narrative. And the town, Oliver asked. Won't they back her? Some will. But courts aren't governed by public sentiment. They're governed by proof, and you have it. So they began. The paperwork was immense. Mallory returned once more, this time with 2 assistants. For 3 days, they photographed every inch of the property, labeled every piece of hardware, and cross-referenced timestamps with cloud backups. They drafted a statement detailing the escalation from the first uninvited group to the night of the bridge sabotage. Oliver gave them everything, his journals, his copies of the emails, even the broken drone in the storage cabinet. It wasn't paranoia now, it was prosecution. Karen, of course, responded immediately. She went public, not through legal channels, but through her platform. A carefully edited video appeared online titled, A Community Divided, a letter from Karen Waits. In it, she stood in her gallery, surrounded by local art and soft lighting, her voice composed and tender. She didn't name Oliver directly, but referred to a growing climate of fear and misinformation that was hindering cultural access to our shared landscape. She called for a return to dialogue and an end to threats and exclusionary behavior. The video went viral, at least within the region. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments. Some questioned her motives. Most praised her grace. A few turned hostile toward the mystery man at the lake. Karen had turned the tide again, just enough to make the legal battle look like cruelty rather than justice. But Oliver didn't flinch. He stayed focused, each step more deliberate than the last. And then, just before the court filing deadline, the turning point came. Mallory, while cross-referencing drone footage timestamps with trail cam feeds, noticed something strange. A short clip from 2 nights before the event, captured from a distance but enhanced digitally. It showed 2 figures arriving by water, cutting along the shoreline under cover of darkness. One of them was Karen. The other, clearly visible in the enhanced frame, was her assistant from the gallery, carrying what appeared to be a portable drill. They had been there, not delegating, not directing from afar. They had come themselves. Mallory found another frame, moments later, showing the assistant kneeling by the bridge support. It wasn't definitive enough for criminal charges, but it was enough to prove Karen had knowingly participated in unauthorized tampering with private infrastructure, on record, days before denying any direct involvement. Delaney called it the lever they needed. The counterclaim was filed with that footage attached. The shift was immediate. Karen went silent. The online campaign paused. The social media posts vanished, archived or deleted. Then came the settlement offer. Delivered quietly, again through the same firm. No apology, no admission of guilt, but a full withdrawal of the original declaratory action and a proposal to enter a mutual non-disparagement agreement. In exchange, she offered to remove all public materials referencing the cabin, cease all promotional trail use involving the property, and pay a modest but significant restitution amount to cover Oliver's legal expenses and damages. Delaney advised caution. "She's hoping to cut her losses without going down in flames," he said. "This doesn't erase what she did, but it ends the war." Oliver thought for a long time before replying. He didn't want revenge. He wanted clarity. He wanted to close the chapter in a way that couldn't be reopened with a wink and a loophole. So he agreed, with amendments. In addition to the original terms, he required a notarized statement confirming she would not reference the cabin in future business endeavors, public or private. He required that all media featuring the property be pulled, not archived. He required that her business remove any verbiage related to legacy access points on the lake, unless such access was formally approved by every landowner involved. It was aggressive. She signed within 24 hours. The war was over. Not in fire, not in collapse, but in paperwork. And when Oliver stood alone at the bridge that evening, the gate still locked, the lights still steady, he felt something deeper than victory. He felt weight lifting off the very air. He had not simply kept what was his. He had redefined the terms under which it could be taken. He had stared down erosion and refused to give way. Karen was gone. Her influence had cracked, not exploded, dissolved quietly under the weight of evidence and the cold logic of law. And Oliver Sloane had done what few men could. He had held the line, and made them turn back. The cabin was quiet again. Not the fragile quiet that follows a storm, but the kind that comes from something being put back where it belongs. The lake resumed its rhythm, slow and uncaring, and the trees no longer leaned in like sentries watching the property line. For the first time in months, Oliver could hear only natural things. The wind brushing the rooftop, the creak of old boards expanding in the sun, the low roll of water against the dock. It wasn't triumph that filled the space around him. It was the long, heavy breath of resolution. Something had been fought for, held, and finally preserved. Not because it was grand or ancient or even historically significant, but because it was his. He spent the following weeks restoring what had been quietly damaged during the long siege. The bridge, though structurally sound, had suffered from the tampering, so he reinforced the support beam with fresh steel brackets, this time painted black to hide the welds. He resealed the gate hinges, added a new lock mechanism with a hardened pin system, and then removed the keypad entirely. No electronics, no wireless override, just a solid analog lock operated by a key he wore around his neck. It wasn't about shutting the world out. It was about ensuring only those who were invited could enter, and he hadn't invited anyone in a long time. Inside the cabin, the changes were less visible, but more deliberate. The cameras were left in place, not because he expected further intrusion, but because they had become a kind of silent witness to what had happened, evidence that, even now, felt necessary to keep. He converted one of the guest rooms into a document room, installing lockable cabinets and organizing every report, affidavit, and piece of evidence into hard copies. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was documentation, a quiet wall of history that proved his side of the story in case the shadows ever tried to rewrite it again. The community, predictably, said nothing. There was no apology, no shift in sentiment, just silence. Karen's gallery remained open, though noticeably more subdued. Her posts, once prolific and poetic, had slowed to occasional reposts of artists' work, absent of any commentary about lakeside access or cultural dialogue. Her influence wasn't gone. It had simply been redirected, turned inward. People still walked the town's main street, browsed the waterfront shops, and nodded politely when they passed Oliver on his rare visits. But the air had changed. There was recognition now, a subtle unease that came from knowing how close they'd come to being part of something very wrong. He was no longer the mystery man at the lake. He was the one who didn't flinch when the pressure came. Mallory returned once more to deliver the final settlement documentation. They sat on the porch as she read through the last of the legal confirmations. When it was done, she didn't offer congratulations. Instead, she said, "Most people break long before this point." "You didn't." He only nodded. There was nothing satisfying in that survival. It hadn't made him stronger. It had just proven that endurance in its purest form was quiet and repetitive, and necessary. When she left, she gave him one last clipboard, a simple folder labeled Closure. Inside was a list of agencies he could notify to formally update property status, remove himself from certain access registries, and, if he chose, file for official, protected site designation. He considered it, not for prestige, but for insulation, for clarity, maybe even for future generations, though he had none of his own. The cabin, after all, wasn't a monument. It was a place where stillness had been earned. Weeks later, on a particularly cold morning, Oliver walked down to the dock and found a small package sitting at the end, wrapped in waterproof plastic, no label. Inside was a sealed envelope and a single item: the broken drone, repaired, duct-taped in places. Flightless, but whole. The envelope contained no note, no apology, only a single photograph. A picture of the cabin at sunrise, taken from the water, unfiltered and quiet. It was old, maybe from the first weeks after he'd moved in, before the intrusion, before the siege. He didn't recognize the angle, but he knew what it meant. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was acknowledgement, from someone, maybe even Karen herself, that he had won without needing to destroy her, that he had held firm without screaming, that he had made a line visible where others saw only open space. He placed the drone on a shelf inside, beside the survey maps and old photos of his uncle. He left the photograph in the drawer. That evening, he sat outside with a mug of black coffee, the air cold enough to sting but not enough to force him inside. The stars were visible, sharp and distant. Somewhere across the water, someone turned off a porch light. Silence returned. The gate stayed locked. The bridge stood firm. And Oliver Sloane, the man who had once only wanted to be left alone, was finally exactly that. Not out of withdrawal, but by choice.